Arizona is one of the fastest growing states in America. New homes, new highways, new cities rising out of the desert. But almost everything you see here depends on one fragile system, a water system that was never designed to support this many people for this long, in a desert that's getting hotter and drier every year. And now, that system is starting to fail. This isn't a future problem, it's already happening. Arizona is one of the driest places in North America. Some areas get less than 10 inches of rain a year, yet cities like Phoenix, Tucson, and Scottsdale didn't just survive. Here they exploded. Phoenix alone has grown from a small desert town into a metro area of nearly 5 million people. That growth wasn't accidental. It was made possible by one thing above all else: imported water. Arizona didn't build cities around water. It built cities by bringing water to the desert at massive scale. And for decades, it worked. But the system that made this possible was built for a very different world. Most of Arizona's water comes from three main sources: local groundwater, the Salt and Verde rivers, and most importantly, the Colorado River. The Colorado River is the lifeline. It supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states. It feeds farms, cities, and power plants. And for Arizona, it's essential. To move that water hundreds of miles inland and uphill, Arizona built one of the most ambitious engineering projects in U.S. history, the Central Arizona Project, or CAP. This system pumps Colorado River water from Lake Havasu, across the desert, and up into Phoenix and Tucson. It's an engineering marvel, but it relies on two dangerous assumptions: that the river would always have enough water, and that demand would never exceed supply. Both assumptions are now collapsing. The Colorado River is shrinking, not slowly, not temporarily, structurally. The river is fed by snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, but rising temperatures mean less snow, earlier melting, more evaporation. Over the last 2 decades, the river has experienced the worst drought in at least 1,200 years. Reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell have dropped to historic lows. And here's the critical part: Arizona does not have senior water rights. When shortages happen, Arizona is one of the first states to lose access. That's already happening now. Some Arizona communities have had their Colorado River allocations cut entirely. Farmers are being forced to abandon fields. Cities are scrambling to replace water they assumed would always be there. The system wasn't designed for permanent shortage. It was designed for abundance. So, what happens when surface water disappears? Arizona turns to groundwater, water that's been trapped underground for thousands of years. For decades, this was treated like a backup plan. But now, it's becoming the main supply in many areas. And here's the problem. In large parts of Arizona, groundwater pumping is barely regulated, or not regulated at all. Developers can build homes without proving there's enough water long term. Rural communities watch their wells dry up as industrial pumping continues nearby. Land literally sinks as aquifers collapse. Once groundwater is gone, it doesn't come back on human timescales. This isn't a drought issue anymore. It's depletion. So if the water system is failing, why does Arizona keep approving new developments? Because growth is profitable, and the consequences are delayed. Water shortages don't show up immediately in cities. Taps still run. Lawns stay green. The risk is pushed into the future, into new suburbs, into poorer communities, into rural areas with no political power. The system rewards short-term expansion while quietly transferring long-term risk. Arizona didn't just build cities on water. It built cities on the assumption that someone else would deal with the consequences later. There's no single moment where everything collapses. Instead, it looks like this. Water gets more expensive. Restrictions become permanent. Certain areas stop being viable for growth. Farming declines. Energy costs rise. Migration patterns shift. The desert doesn't suddenly reclaim the cities, but life here becomes harder, more unequal, and more fragile every year. And once confidence in the water system disappears, growth doesn't just slow, it reverses. And here's the part that makes this especially difficult to fix. Arizona's water system isn't just stressed, it's locked in. Most of the infrastructure that supplies these cities was designed decades ago, based on assumptions that no longer hold. Assumptions about climate, about population growth, about how much water the Colorado River could reliably provide. Those assumptions were made in a very different era, when temperatures were lower, when snowpack was more predictable, when the river ran stronger year after year, and when Arizona's population was a fraction of what it is today. But the cities built on top of those assumptions can't easily adapt. You can't relocate millions of people. You can't pick up Phoenix or Tucson and move them closer to water. You can't rebuild an entire state's water system from scratch without decades of construction, massive disruption, and enormous cost. And you can't undo water rights agreements without years, sometimes generations, of legal battles. So instead of decisive change, the system drifts. Water shortages don't arrive as a single collapse. They don't show up as empty taps or abandoned cities overnight. They arrive as a slow tightening. Restrictions that were once framed as temporary quietly become permanent. Water rules grow more complex. Exceptions disappear. Costs rise, not dramatically, but steadily enough that people barely notice year to year. New developments don't stop immediately. They just get pushed farther from city centers, farther from existing infrastructure, farther from reliable water access. Growth doesn't end, it stretches. And stretching a system that's already under strain only makes it weaker. And the people who feel this first are rarely the ones making the decisions. Rural towns lose wells as groundwater levels drop. Small communities watch their water sources disappear while nearby pumping continues. Farmers fall out of production, not because demand disappears, but because water does. Fields that were productive for generations are left dry. Local economies shrink, jobs vanish. And once farming infrastructure is gone, it rarely comes back. Lower-income neighborhoods feel it differently. Higher bills, stricter usage limits, less flexibility. While wealthier areas absorb the costs more easily, at least for now. From the outside, everything still looks normal. The taps still work. The lawns are still green. Pools are still full. Construction cranes are still visible on the skyline. But underneath that appearance, the margin for error disappears. And that's what makes this dangerous, because systems don't fail when everything is broken. They fail when there's no slack left, when one bad year becomes one bad year too many, when a heat wave lasts longer than expected, when a dry winter stacks on top of another dry winter. Arizona's growth model depends on confidence. Confidence that water will be there tomorrow. Confidence that new homes are viable long-term. Confidence that the system can absorb shocks without cascading failure. Once that confidence starts to crack, growth doesn't just slow, it reverses. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Fewer people move in, more people quietly leave. Insurance becomes harder to get, or more expensive. Investment pulls back. Developers hesitate. Municipal budgets tighten. Cities don't vanish. They hollow out. Services degrade. Infrastructure ages faster than it can be repaired. Economic opportunity concentrates elsewhere. And this isn't just an Arizona problem. Arizona is one of the first places where these limits are becoming impossible to ignore, where the math is tightening enough to show through the surface. But it won't be the last. Other fast-growing regions across the American West are watching closely, because the same pressures are building elsewhere. Hotter temperatures, strained rivers, overpromised water supplies, infrastructure built for a past that no longer exists. Arizona is a warning, not of sudden collapse, but of what happens when modern cities are built on systems that can't scale forever. The desert doesn't need to reclaim the cities. There doesn't need to be a dramatic ending. It just needs the math to stop working. And once it does, no amount of optimism, no amount of growth, and no amount of political delay can bring the water back. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Water crises don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with sirens or headlines. They arrive quietly, through paperwork, pricing, and policy. By the time most people realize something is wrong, the system has already adjusted around them. That's what makes Arizona different from places that collapse suddenly. There's no single disaster to point to, No moment you can rewind. Just a long series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. A subdivision approved here, a well drilled there, another delay, another exemption. Each one small, each one defensible, but together they reshape the future. Because once a city grows past the limits of its water, the question is no longer whether the system will strain, it's who absorbs the cost. And in Arizona, that cost is being distributed unevenly, across communities, across generations, across people who didn't benefit equally from the growth in the first place. This is what a modern resource crisis looks like. Not collapse, but compression. A narrowing of options, a shrinking margin, a future that becomes less flexible every year. And Arizona sits at the front edge of that reality. What happens here won't stay here, because the forces shaping this crisis, climate pressure, population growth, aging infrastructure, aren't unique to one state. They're spreading. The Southwest is just where the limits are appearing first, which makes Arizona more than a case study. It makes it a preview, a glimpse of how modern cities respond when the systems they depend on stop expanding and start contracting. There's still time to change course, but change doesn't come from optimism. It comes from acknowledging limits and planning within them, because the desert isn't hostile, it's honest. It gives exactly what it has, and no more. And the cities built within it will have to learn the same lesson. In the next video, we'll look at why Arizona continues approving new developments, even as these limits become impossible to ignore, because understanding how this happened is the first step toward understanding what comes next.